between us, what we thought we'd try and do is just introduce you to the 2 aeroplanes, or the 3 aeroplanes that we flew between us. And just, we'll start with a little sort of question and answer session between ourselves to sort of introduce ourselves. But then very much at the end, we'd like to open it up to the floor for questions. So if you think of questions as we run through, then feel free to ask them at the end. Let me start. I joined the Air Force back in 1973, and I went through officer training, and I was then posted on to the Phantom as a navigator. I think back then Pontius was a pilot, so I'm not that old, I don't think, but nearly. I did 2 operational tours on the aeroplane, both in the UK and in Germany, and also a stint down in the Falkland Islands after the war. I then transferred across onto the Tornado F2 when it first came into service in 1986, and I was one of the first instructors on the Tornado when it was brought in as a fighter aeroplane. I then went away for a ground tour, but then came back as the executive officer and second in command of the operational conversion unit, which was where we trained all the pilots and navigators to fly the Tornado F3 before they went on into operational service. And Mike will give a quick rundown on his background.
Yep, my name is Mike Napier, and I joined the RAF about 5 years after Dave. I then spent 3 years at university, but ended up in the back end of 1985 posted out to Germany, out to RAF Bruggen as a Tornado GR1 pilot. I then spent 2 tours at Bruggen, just at the back end of the Cold War, and then when my brave colleagues went off to fight the Gulf War, I went the other way and went off to Chivenor in North Devon, where I was a tactics instructor on the Tactical Weapons Unit, flying the Hawk, which was great fun. After that, I was then posted back to Germany as a flight commander, and the Iraqi experience was still going on then, so I then did some operational flying out over southern Iraq. A couple of ground tours and left, and I've been flying airliners since then. Both Dave and I, since we've retired, have started writing books, hence all this lot out here. But today, we're going to talk to you about the Phantom, the Tornado F3 and the Tornado GR1.
Let me start with the Phantom then. You've probably seen one if you've wandered around the hangar. There's one over in the far corner there, and we'll be over there later if anybody has questions that they sort of think up as we move through the day. We'll be very happy to answer them. Phantom was a stopgap purchase. We'd just cancelled the TSR-2, so the new bomber aeroplane was no more. So the government looked around for something to replace it, and initially they ordered the F-111, which was a swing-wing fighter bomber, and that was going to come into service and be based at Coningsby, but that was also cancelled. So the government had got us into a right hole, and the Phantom was the thing that got us out of the hole. It was bought, in theory, off the shelf, but actually we did an awful lot of work on it. We put British engines into it, the Rolls-Royce Spey, and it was the first time. It was a civilian engine, but they bolted an afterburner system onto the back of it. So it was quite a challenge to get this configuration to work. We bought about 160, 170 of them. The first squadrons were actually with the Navy, the Royal Navy, and they flew off HMS Ark Royal, the carrier. And that was the Mark I Phantom, the FG-1. We also had a squadron in the Royal Air Force, 43 Squadron, who flew the Mark I aeroplane, and that was based up at Lucas. So for the first few years, just those 2 squadrons did air defence. The other Mark IIs, the FGR-2s, were bomber aeroplanes in the early days, and for about the first 7 years, it was based mostly in Germany, but did the bombing role, both nuclear bombing and conventional bombing. Before, in about 1974-75, it switched over to the air defence role, and that was where I came in. I joined the Phantom Conversion Unit in 1975, and then converted as a fighter gator, and we then used it as a fighter aeroplane right until it went out of service in 1992. Interestingly, the Phantom that you'll see in the far corner of the hangar there was the one that flew the last operational sortie in the Royal Air Force, so it's got a real history as that particular aeroplane. I'll be happy to chat about it later if you want to pop over. So that was the Phantom. I think my first tour I started off in the UK, at Wattisham, down in Suffolk there. But very quickly, my second tour was over in Germany. And Germany was an awful lot different to the way we operated in UK. In UK, we still had a little bit of a Battle of Britain mentality. We would operate from the crew room, and when we were on exercise, we'd be scrambled out to our aeroplanes, we'd rush across the grass and climb in and go off flying. So a little bit sort of, there was a little bit of a false sense of, a strange sense about the way we operated. Germany, completely different. We operated from a hardened accommodation, so all the aircraft operated from hardened aircraft shelters. We operated from a concrete bunker called a pilot's briefing facility, and everything was painted green. If it moved, it got painted green, because the idea was that if the Russians ever did come across the border, then they wouldn't be able to see us on the ground. It didn't quite work that way, unfortunately. The big reason for us being over there was we held what was known as battle flight, and you will see airplanes on quick reaction alert today. There's 2 Typhoons on 24 hours readiness up at Coningsby even as we speak, and we would operate from readiness 5 over in Germany, so if the hooter went, we had to be airborne and off in 5 minutes, which in a Phantom was quite a challenge. The whole point was to reinforce, or rather to patrol, the inner German border, the old Berlin Wall as was. And we had a buffer zone out there. 30 miles west of the inner German border was a thing called the Air Defensive Interception Zone, and nobody was allowed to fly in that area. Essentially, it was sanitized airspace, and the whole point was if the East Germans or the Russians came our way, we would be sent into the ADIS to intercept them and basically send them off back east again. So that was our principal reason for being there. Obviously, if the Russians had rolled over the inner German border and World War III had broken out, then we were the line of defense. It was a layered defense in Germany. We had missiles up against the border. We had high-level missiles which covered the upper airspace above those low-level missiles, and then we and the fighters were normally operating at the back, so towards the western side of the combat airspace. And the idea being that if they broke through the missile zones, then we would be pushed forward to plug the gaps in that zone as the Russians rolled forward. And bear in mind, we thought at the time that if World War III did break out, the Russians would try to move through West Germany and into the Low Countries, and they would try to do that within 5 days. So it would have been a very brief but very fierce conflict as we saw it at that time. And we were the air defense forces that would have stopped that. I'll hand over to Mike now, because Mike's experience was on the Tornado bombers, and he was also based in Germany. And I think it's probably fair to say, Mike, that there were lots of different roles over in Germany, and maybe you could give us an idea of what those roles were.
Well, worthwhile talking quickly about the aeroplane. There is a Tornado GR1 here somewhere. Unfortunately, it's not in this hangar. I think it's in the airspace one at the back there. But Dave described the integrated air defense system that was in Germany. The same thing was mirrored on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and the only way that one could get through all that, the tactics that we thought were to go under it. So we were very much in the Tornado force, the low-level kings. We were looking at low flying to get in under radar cover and get in towards the target. The problem, of course, is if you're low flying, it needs to be a day like today. You need to be able to see the ground. So you're limited to daylight, you're limited to good weather. And what the Tornado brought with it was a fantastic computerized system which included terrain following radar and a ground mapping radar. And what that meant was the terrain following radar meant that you could actually fly at night, or you could fly in bad weather at low level and get below the enemy radars. And then the ground mapping radar meant that you could actually then locate the target. So once Tornado GR1 came into service, that was probably the first time ever that the Royal Air Force had a true 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year deep strike capability. In Germany, there were four stations in Germany. Dave's was at Wildenroth, where the air defenders were. Gütersloh out to the east had the Harriers, which are close support aircraft, but the other two bases at Bruggen and at Marlborough were strike attack wings, each with 4 squadrons of Tornado GR1. Our prime role was that of nuclear strike, and Dave talked about QRA guys ready to go with to defend the airspace. We actually also had guys on QRA away with nuclear bombs ready to go as well if the war started. Happily it didn't start, so we didn't go anywhere, but aircraft that were not required for that would be available for normal conventional attack sorties and missions in wartime. And for us, that would be operating over East Germany or Western Poland, and our prime targets were the airfields that the Warsaw Pact were using. So we'd aim to go across those with JP233, which is a rather strange, this big canister that hung under the aircraft filled with minelets, and the idea was you'd fly across and you drop this sort of 2.5 kilometre stick of minelets and things which then blow up runways. The original plan was we were to fly down the runway at 200 feet. Everybody's thinking, well, that's a pretty stupid thing to do, really. So we decided in the end we'd actually fly across, and that's actually what the guys did during the Gulf War against airfields in Iraq. If we weren't going for the airfields, then we'd be looking at the strategic surface-to-air missile SAM-5, because that could, from bases in East Germany, could actually reach out across to where the AWACS and radar, NATO radar aircraft were, and tankers, so we'd aim to take those out, and also command and control bunkers, places where the reinforcements coming through. There was, I think, right to the east of Germany, where Poland joined it, there was a change of gauge in the railway lines. That was obviously a bit of a choke point. So places like that would be what we'd be aiming to go. And we'd aim probably to do it at night time or in bad weather if we possibly could, because that meant that there'd be no fighters and things around. Peacetime training, most of West Germany was a low-flying area, so we could actually low-fly down to 500 feet over most of it, and then areas of 250 feet. We also trained to go out to the United States, out to an exercise called Red Flag, and that was where the Americans had discovered that in Vietnam, that if guys could get through the first 10 missions, then they'd probably make it to the end of the tour. Most of the losses were guys who just arrived. So the theory was that if you went out to this exercise that was so realistic, then you'd effectively do your first sort of 10 war missions somewhere that was pretty realistic but not entirely fatal to you. So they'd actually got entire full-scale replicas of Soviet airfields out there. That, I'd say, is basically it in terms of the Tornado GR1, our war role, and the training that we did.
Let me pick up on some of the training, because it's a question that we're often asked. How were you trained in order to fly, a fast jet aeroplane, something like the Phantom? It did vary. It varied between the forces, and Mike was on the ground attack side. I was on the air-to-air side. For an air-to-air pilot, it probably took about 4 years from starting basic flying training through to arriving on a squadron. And then once on the squadron, it was another 6 months before you were combat ready. For a pilot, it would start at an elementary flying training school, taught how to fly a tiny little aeroplane, maybe like the Chipmunk, something along those lines. Before then moving on to the Jet Provost, a very small jet aeroplane, which they were taught basic handling skills and how to fly a jet aeroplane. And then on to Valley for advanced flying training, but this was still very much biased towards teaching you to be a pilot, not to operate a system. That came later, a tactical weapons unit, which was the unit that Mike was posted to. And here was where you started to understand how to fight an aeroplane rather than just fly it. So that was tactical appreciation for a pilot. You then moved on to a thing called an operational conversion unit, and this was teaching you how to fly the aeroplane that you were going to fly on your squadron, but also, most importantly, how to operate the weapons system and how to fight the aeroplane for real. My main role, I ended up as an instructor both on the Phantom and the Tornado, and we would convert crews to fly the combat aeroplane. Now, as a navigator, my preparation before I joined the course was very poor. We were sat in the back of a Domini and pointing backwards, looking at a radar scope, which was nothing like a Phantom. We then did sort of 12 hours in a Jet Provost, looking at a map and playing with a stopwatch, teaching us how to navigate around at low level, not a technique that we used in the Phantom. And then we were put into a Phantom, which was very much what we were going to fly, and then had to learn it at that point. So our training really started when we climbed into the operational aeroplane, so that's 6 months at the operational conversion unit. Now, how do we do that? Well, the first thing was to convert the pilots onto the aeroplane. This is the Phantom, this is its strengths, this is its weaknesses, and this is how you fly it. And that's what they started off doing. That was very pilot intensive, and we in the back just had 3 or 4 sorties just to get used to playing with the knobs and switches in the back there. But we then moved on to the first operational phase, if you will, and it was called basic radar. And during the basic radar phase, we were taught how to do an intercept. So how to point at another aeroplane, which is coming at you at 400 miles an hour, and you're pointing at him doing 400 miles an hour as well. And what you have to do is roll out 2 miles behind him. Now that sounds easy enough, but when you're closing at 800 miles an hour, it happens really quickly, and you have to have certain procedures to be able to do that. And that was all done on the radar in the front of the aeroplane, which we controlled in the back cockpit. So that was basic radar. At that point, the world turned upside down, literally, because we then went into what was called the air combat phase. And at this time now, the bad guy who had been really nice to you up to this time and just flown straight lines, now he started fighting back. And whenever you did something, he would do something back. So he would turn away and try and stop you making your intercept. And then when you found each other, you then went into the sort of turning and burning fighting. And that was called air combat. And literally at that point, the world turned upside down. Everything became three-dimensional, and you had to learn to understand what was happening around you in your little bubble. And that was quite a challenge at that time. We then finished off with a thing called the advanced radar phase, and on this we looked at more esoteric targets, so something that might be coming through supersonic, or something that might be coming through at a really high level, or maybe a low-level formation of 2 aeroplanes which was evading. So we'd go into more advanced profiles, and that would set you up for what you would then learn on the operational squadron. You then moved to your squadron, and basically that period from arriving up to being declared combat ready, you looked at more advanced techniques yet again. And this would be things like air-to-air refueling, which was a technique in itself. Electronic warfare, so where the target out there, instead of being a nice target that you can find on your radar, starts jamming you on your radar. So your radar's a mess, and you have to work through that. And various other difficult sort of profiles like that. And by the end of it, if you'd survived, if you were still going, you would be declared combat ready. And then the real pain started, because then you were allowed to do exercises. So you put your gas mask on every week, and you went out into hardened shelter and wearing a tin helmet, and that's life got quite interesting. But that was the cycle. Now for a pilot, that probably took 4 years up to the squadron. For a navigator, probably a little bit quicker, maybe 18 months to 2 years. So a lot shorter course for a navigator.
I started at RAF Cranwell flying the jet bombers, then across the valley to fly the Hawk, down to Chivenor to learn to fight the Hawk, and then I was selected to convert to the Tornado at that stage. And that was done in 2 phases. There was the Tri-National Tornado Training Establishment, which was run, the aircraft was built in collaboration with the Germans and the Italians, and the idea was that we'd actually train pilots and navigators in collaboration with them as well. So this Tri-National unit was there, which was fantastic actually, because the RAF training system was one where there was little sympathy and not much patience. So you get shown something, you then do it, and if you get it wrong, you might get it wrong once, but that's it. Wrong twice and you're out. So we suddenly arrived and did things the German Italian way, which is all much more touchy-feely and rather friendly and rather helpful actually. So we had a very nice, gentle introduction to the Tornado, how to fly it, and then back to the RAF to learn how to fight with it. And most of the weapons conversion course was reinforcing tactics we'd already learned at Chivenor, but also learning the various weapon delivery methods. Because the thing about Tornado is that you could actually attack targets in many, many different ways. The easiest perhaps is to just overfly the target and drop a bomb on it, but again, if you're talking about closing on a target at sort of 500 miles an hour, at probably 150 feet, things are moving quite fast, so you've got to get things right, so it does take a bit of practice. The other method which we used quite a lot was actually to throw the bombs at the target, and by there, if you come in about 500 knots again, and then you pull up, and as you pull up, the computer works out the best time to release the bombs. It then lobs them over about 4 miles ahead. So if you're dropping a stick of bombs, it's certainly accurate enough to actually probably hit somebody with one of those bombs. But the problem really was then how you got away from this, having pulled yourself up, how you got back down to low level again. So it's a fairly intricate manoeuvre that one did entirely on instruments in order to get yourself back down to low level safely, so that you weren't exposed to anti-aircraft fire, etc. during the delivery phase. So having mastered these various methods, one got posted out to a squadron, and as Dave said, first 6 months on a squadron, you are really just the broom tea making boy. You're learning of the trade, and you're actually not much used to the squadron. It did take about 6 months worth of flying in theatre, getting used to the aeroplane, getting used to working in formation and other such things to actually become combat ready. But then once you're combat ready, then the world's your oyster, and off you go, flying around Germany at low level, having a great time, and fighting the likes of Dave in the low-flying areas of Germany. Dave, do you want to tell us about the F3 now? So we talked about the Phantom Combat.
And the idea for the aeroplane was we wanted a new interceptor aeroplane, and this aeroplane had to be able to fight Russian bombers. That was what the MOD at the time thought that the threat was going to be. So the bombers that you might have seen in the news, the Bears, the Badgers, the Backfires, the Blinders, these were the things that we expected to fight against. Sadly, as we all know, it came in 1986, and I was on one of the first courses, but by 1989 the wall had fallen and the Cold War had ended and the threat had gone away, it says here. We suddenly found that the Russians weren't coming over quite so much, and instead of that type of operation, we were asked to increasingly go out of area into places like the Gulf and different environments, which the airplane frankly wasn't suited to. It was an interceptor airplane. It didn't turn as well as some of the American airplanes that were its peers, and it didn't turn as well as some of the later Soviet airplanes, such as the Fulcrum and the Flanker, the MiG-29 and the Su-27, which were just coming into service at that time. Now, when it came into service in 1985, some of you may have heard of a thing called the Blue Circle radar. And the radar in the F3 was called Fox Hunter. And this was going to be the big thing. The reason the F3 was going to be so good was we had the Fox Hunter radar, which was super magic, and it would do everything for you. And sadly, when it arrived, it didn't. The reason it got the nickname Blue Circle was because when the airplane first arrived, it came ahead of the radars, which were delayed. So when we first got the aircraft on the squadron, literally a dozen of them didn't have any radars at all. Now, you couldn't fly a Tornado without something in the front, so instead of putting a Fox Hunter radar in the front, they put a big piece of concrete in there, and you're probably now seeing the link with Blue Circle, because Blue Circle was a famous concrete manufacturer at the time, and the bit that went in the front was Blue Circle. Now, everybody then thought that we were being derisory about the Fox Hunter radar, and that it was a piece of concrete. It wasn't quite that bad, but at that time it was really close to it. So when it first arrived, it didn't work at all. And the track while scan system, which was one of its big improvements, really didn't work. It didn't track the targets as it was supposed to do. And what that did was it put a lot of pressure on us in the back, because instead of the system doing all the work for you, we suddenly found that we were having to do an awful lot of work, and it was a big sort of switchery problem in the back cockpit. So we identified the problems, and then for the first 5 or 6 years, various fix-it programs were introduced. New contracts were let with industry, a lot of development went into it, and by about 1990, 1991, the radar was starting to come good, but by then it had a really bad reputation and everybody thought it was useless. It did improve, and it improved rapidly after that, because not only did we get the Stage 2 radar, which was the standard we should have got in the first place, but we then added new weapons to it. Instead of Skyflash and AIM-9L, which it came into service with, we added the AMRAAM and the ASRAAM missiles, both of which gave hugely extended missile envelopes, much more capable, much better in electronic warfare sort of arena, and suddenly the airplane came good. About the same time, we added data link, and data link was a leap ahead of everything that we'd known up to that time. Suddenly, instead of just having your own radar picture, the things like the E3 Sentry fed data link information into the cockpit, and you could see everything that everybody else could. Suddenly you could see the whole battlefield out to about 300 miles. And that changed, that revolutionized the way that the Tornado operated. But sadly at this stage, everybody thought it was the airplane that had come into service because of its poor reputation. Arguably, the Tornado F3 that retired in 2011 was a really capable airplane, as good as some of the American airplanes that were flying at the time, such as the F-15. It didn't turn as well. If you took it up to height, it didn't perform very well because the engines were quite small, designed for the low-level environment. But the actual kit in the airplane was working extremely well by then. So in 1992, it retired as a very capable aircraft, sadly with a terrible reputation. But good to fly anyway. Still lots of fun.
I mentioned that having flown the airplane in a low-level role for 5 years at the end of the Cold War. I went off to be an instructor. I then came back to Bruggen again, back to the Tornado, and discovered that everything had changed. The Russians had given up and gone home, and we were no longer able to low fly in Germany. But also in that time the Gulf War had been fought, and where over Iraq over Eastern Germany there had been this integrated air defence system which we had to go under. In Iraq that wasn't there anymore, it had been taken out during the Gulf War. So without the constraints either of European weather, where you've got clear airspace like today and nobody's going to shoot a missile at you, then you can afford to be much higher up and you can afford to operate at medium level. At the end of the Gulf War there was a no-fly zone established at the bottom end of below the 32nd parallel in Iraq, and the idea was that the Iraqis were not to fly any aircraft in that to support their ground forces, because at that time there was some of a campaign going on against insurgents down in the south of the country, and we were there to stop them actually getting aircraft into it. The RAF role of that was to act as reconnaissance aircraft, and we had the laser designator pod, and that was designed to designate targets for aircraft to drop laser bombs on, but it had a really good camera, and it also had a video recording system in it. And so what we did was we'd go flying over southern Iraq, following various line searches or looking at various points of interest and filming it and bringing the film back for the photo interpreters to look at. And there's all a bit of a culture shock to me, because at low level in Germany we'd never had to do anything like air-to-air refueling, and suddenly we were now getting airborne from Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, an hour's transit up at medium level up to the Iraqi border, and there would be a tanker, so you had to then do air-to-air refueling, which is actually quite a tricky thing to do if you've never done it before. The tanker streams a hose, about 30-foot long hose out the back of it with a big, it looks like a shuttlecock, for badminton shuttlecock, and it's about, I guess, probably about that big. And the probe on your aircraft, on Tornado 1, came out on the right-hand side of the cockpit, and it sat actually just out about there, right out of your field of view by about 10 feet or so. So what you had to do was to line yourself up so that this basket that was there was going to fly up to there somewhere and make contact. And you had, I guess, probably, you had to be going, if you're going too fast, then you'd bounce off it. If you're going too slow, then you couldn't make contact. There's probably about 5 knots worth of speed you had to get exactly right. You then had to get within this sort of 2-foot circle. And bearing in mind that this thing would be bobbling up and down, and also as you got closed into it, there's a bow wave on the airplane, and then would make the basket move up and away from you. So you had to sort of offset all that. So that was quite a tricky little way to start the sortie, and then you headed off over Iraq to take the film that we'd been asked to do. We used to fly in pairs because there was a bit of a threat from ground fire, anti-aircraft guns particularly, and you can't actually see what's underneath you if you're up at 10 or 20,000 feet. So what we do is fly in pairs where we could just see under each other. So you fly next to each other a couple of miles apart, checking underneath yourselves. While we were there, the Iraqis decided that we really shouldn't be doing that, and so they decided that they'd take control of the no-fly zone again, and they did that by moving surface-to-air missiles systems underneath it, with the idea they'd engage us, and also sending fighters into the no-fly zone as well. And this came to, culminated really in the beginning of 1993, and the coalition decided that this wasn't to happen, so we ended up flying a couple of airstrikes against all the nodal points of the Iraqi air defence system, trying to take out their command and control and their radars. And we were dispatched one night with a package of probably about 100 aircraft actually, of which we had 4 RAF Tornadoes to take out radar control buildings and headquarters, which we did very successfully. And then about a week later we did the same thing on a daylight raid at the leftover targets, which had been missed on the first night. And that really was my excitement in Iraq. Dave, do you want to talk about books now, or do you want to move on to something else?
I'll just mention one other topic before we move on to the books. But whilst Mike was doing all this down in sandy places, I I was sent down a little bit farther south, and I ended up as the commander on the Tornado flight down there. So OC 1435 flight. We had originally been based at RAF Stanley after the war, and around about 1987, the Phantoms moved up to a brand new airfield up at Mount Pleasant. Its name was Mount Pleasant, but it was far from it. It was in the middle of a field in the middle of nowhere, about 30 miles from the capital. And I had 4 aeroplanes, and I had 55 ground crew, and I had 10 aircrew, and my job was to hold off the Argentinian hordes for the first 48 hours of any conflict. So the idea was a holding action until the islands were reinforced from the UK. And we had fairly comprehensive plans of how to get forces down into theatre should the Argentinians decide that they were going to have another go at the Falkland Islands. The Falklands was quite different to the UK. It sounds like a common theme, but it was also a very large low-flying area, and you could fly anywhere around both East and West Falklands at low level, from the ground up to the moon, as much of the airspace as you wanted to use. We held 2 aeroplanes on constant readiness, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and that was absolutely paramount. There was no excuse for those aeroplanes not being serviceable and on QRA, ready to go, should anybody intrude into the Falklands zone. The other 2 aeroplanes we had, as you can imagine, at the end of an 8,000 foot or an 8,000 mile supply chain, then keeping 4 aeroplanes going permanently was quite a challenge. So quite often an aeroplane would go unserviceable, it would need a spare part, it would have to be sent down from the UK, and literally it was a case of getting that spare part into theatre as quickly as you possibly could. So QRA was our reason for being there, and then what little extra effort we could mount with the other 2 aeroplanes, we flew training sorties there. What were the islanders like? Well, they were absolutely fantastic. They're more patriotic than you and I. They really are very, very, very pro-British and lovely people. There's no doubt that they want to remain British in my mind. So we were there to make sure that they got their wishes, and as we all know, at the recent referendum, I think they had a 98.9% turnout, and I think there were 2 people that said no, and I suspect they know who those 2 people were. So yeah, very, very patriotic indeed. Quite an experience, having my own little train set 8,000 miles from home. So not surprisingly, nobody was particularly interested in what I got up to. The brief was just get on with it and make sure you defend the islands. But really quite a fascinating sort of time. I had been there down once before, and funnily enough, the aeroplane that's over in the far corner there, that particular Phantom, we were asked to bring that and another aeroplane back home to the UK for major servicing. So that had been serving down on 23 Squadron at Stanley, and that was the other aeroplane in my formation on the way back. So that was my experiences down there, and again, happy to chat. We'll be over there later on if anybody wants to come and chat further. Mike mentioned the books, so I'll start with mine, but I retired from the Air Force 5 years ago and started writing. I've stuck very much to the sort of topics and the things that I understand, and my first book was Phantom in Focus, specifically talking about the Phantom. I then wrote the book about the Falkland Islands, which is day-to-day experiences, the sort of stuff that we got to on a daily basis. And then my third book was the Tornado F3 in Focus, which looks a little bit more about the airplane and the politics and what we got and why we got it, and those are the 3. I've also branched out into novels. I have yes indeed, yeah. Well, in fact, I've got a 4th book is published, and then I've got 2 more in edit at the minute, so they'll be out later on in the year, so I've been busy, yes. I've also branched out because I've written... Yeah. Retirement's really busy. I've also branched out into novels, and I've got 4 novels published on a fictional Phantom fighter crew who go out and do daring do in various theatres of the world, and always come home for tea and medals, as you would expect. Yeah. So quite fun. Mike, your titles are a lot more diverse, though. You've branched out in all sorts of areas.
Yeah. Like Dave, I seem to be a bit bitten by the writing bug, and I started off because I'd helped run a 14 Squadron Association. Now, 14 Squadron is actually one of the senior squadrons of the Royal Air Force, but one which probably nobody's ever heard of, largely because it spent the first 50-odd years of its life out in the Middle East, all through World War I and II, and the middle part of it as well, interwar years, and then went to Germany, and was in Germany right up till 2001. So again, people generally haven't heard of the squadron, but there's so much that the guys got up to, and I was in contact with a lot of wartime guys, and the material I got in terms of photographs and stories of what they got up to, I thought really shouldn't be lost. So I decided to write up the squadron history, that's how I got into the writing thing. So I did a 2-volume history of 14 Squadron. I then actually wrote my own little thing, and this is my own sort of memoir of flying fast jets around the back end of the Cold War, and then over operations over the Gulf after the Gulf War, and the bit in between flying the Hawk and having great fun at Chivner. And I hope that kind of brings or enables me to share that experience with people reading it and being able to live it through reading the books. I've kind of got also into writing up. I've always been a bit of an aircraft spotter. I've just written a book about the Gloucester Javelin. There's red and white Javelin over there, and that again was fascinating because you can. I was trying to think of what can I bring to writing about something like that, and that was the fact that having flown fast jet airplanes myself, I was able to talk to other aircrew and again other ground crew who serviced it, and find out what it was like from their perspective, rather than what it was like to build the aeroplane, or what it looks like at an air show. This was, what was it like being on a Javelin squadron? What did the guys get up to flying it and working on it? So that's where I've gone, and I've just done also one on the Tornado JR1, again a subject close to my heart, on covering the operational history of that, again what people got up to actually on frontline squadrons. A thinly disguised attempt here to sell our books. We're going to be over by the Javelin and the Phantom with, if anybody's interested in looking at these books. In the meantime, if anybody's got any questions, we'd be very happy to answer them, and anything about either aeroplanes or flying or whatever. So that's one of those. Good.
That was just about the time it moved up to Mount Pleasant. The aeroplanes moved down from Ascension Island, where they were based during the war, and the Phantom couldn't operate from RAF Stanley until the runway was upgraded. The original strip was 4,000 feet long, which was long enough for a Harrier, but not long enough for a Phantom. So they put another extension onto the runway, making it 6,000 feet, and covered it in a thing called AN2 matting. And this literally was metal matting over the whole of the surface. And the Phantom operated from that at RAF Stanley. Now the Phantoms moved down from Ascension and operated at squadron strength, so 23 Squadron, from about 1980, back end of 82, early 83 I think it was, right the way through to 87. At which time RAF Stanley closed and Mount Pleasant then opened up as a new airfield. It moved up, and I think it kept squadron strength for a couple of months at that point with 8 airplanes, but then airplanes were brought home and it went down to 4 airplanes, and that's a flight size. So it became 1435 flight. Initially on Phantoms, then replaced by the Tornado, now replaced by the Typhoon, and the Typhoon has 4 airplanes down there now. They did. That's a funny story, actually. Yeah, 1435 flight, when it was in Malta during the war, had 3 Gloucester Gladiators, and they were Faith, Hope, and Charity. And when 1435 flight formed, the new boss decided that a bit of history, and it would be nice to have Faith, Hope, and Charity on the flight. So the aeroplanes. Code letter Foxtrot became Faith, Charlie, yep, you got the drift. Now you'll see a problem because there were 4 aeroplanes, so we're 1 short. Now that was Delta, and Delta became Desperation. So Faith, Hope, Charity, and Desperation.
When you said you got the ground mapping, did the enemy, the Russians, Eastern Bloc, did they have it as well at the same time?
I don't think they must have had some sort of radar system to find targets. I'm not quite sure how good it was. The Tornado ground map area was excellent. It was certainly the best that I think of any of the NATO aircraft, and certainly at that stage better than things like, well, I think the F-15E is probably a slightly better one now, but it was actually, that's what it did. I mean, it made. It was in the back seat, but occasionally I look at radar film, and it would actually look like a photograph. It was that good, and so we'd find you use corners of woods and things as as things as offsets that you see. So it was actually remarkably good for finding almost anything. A really, really good bit of kit.
So that enabled you to fly low level?
Oh, sorry, that was finding a target. For low level, it was a terrain following radar, so there were actually two different ones, yeah. And what that did was you plug that into the autopilot and told it how high you wanted to fly. So you go, right, I'm flying 300 feet, and then this thing would just keep you at 300 feet, yeah. So I think I'm not sure if the Russians had a similar thing or not. I think we had the same system as the F-111 had, but it was very effective. They're quite scary actually. It's going along, particularly we go out in Canada into Goose Bay where we're allowed to do it actually in cloud, because in Europe you couldn't, in case there was airplanes like this flying around which you couldn't see. Good here. So if you're heading towards this sort of big mountain with the airplane flying itself, and suddenly you're waiting until you're in and out of cloud as well, it's really quite, it did concentrate the mind somewhat as you looked to make sure the machine was doing it. We had a little scope on the side which showed us what the radar was seeing, so you could see whether it was going to work or not. But yes, when you're heading towards a big mountain full of rock at 400 miles an hour, waiting for this machine to take you above it, there's a few moments of heart-stopping moments while you wait for it to happen.
There's the cumulus granitus.
Indeed, yes.
One more question.
It's interesting though, to pick up on that though. The Soviets had a slightly different mentality to us. They tended to go for lower technology, but quite robust and quite easy to maintain and operate. We tended to go more for the high-tech, more advanced, as Mike says, a radar that would give you something that looked like a photograph, whereas they would go for something a bit more agricultural. So there were strengths and weaknesses of both tactics. We were more reliant on spares and capability and technical expertise. The Soviets were more agricultural, but they worked, and they were, without a doubt. Later on, though, I think they've definitely caught up.
I think in the air shows in the 90s, you could see the difference even physically.
Absolutely, yeah. And the current generation of Soviet aeroplanes, things like the Sukhoi Mu-30, which the Indians now operate, highly technological and extremely capable. So nowadays it's a lot different.
One more question, please. That place in America where you went to pretend that you've been on 9 missions, where is it?
That's Las Vegas, so literally Las Vegas, Nellis Air Force Base, just on the outskirts. So we used to go there, and it was a sort of every boy's dream really. You'd spend 2 weeks flying, low level, having great fun, scaring yourself silly, but really exciting times. And then in the evening you go down to the strip and gamble your money away.
Or the chicken run.
I should fess up here because I was actually lucky enough to be the Air Warfare Centre liaison officer at Nellis Air Force Base for 3 years. So I was actually looking after some of the red flag exercises 2004 to 2007. So my job was not only to do testing and trials over there, but to act as the British representative on the Air Warfare Centre staff. So it was a tough duty, and somebody had to step up to the plate, but I was in there. I did my duty. And Las Vegas was a strange place. Any more questions? Anything, not necessarily the stuff that we've talked about. If you've got other questions about the airplanes or life in general in the Air Force. Yeah? No, Typhoons, and I'm struggling to remember which date it happened, but it's a good time ago now. But they're now Typhoons, 4 airplanes still, so the idea was to keep the same level of deterrence. Obviously the Typhoon is a more capable airplane nowadays, a bit more of a turning and burning machine. Very capable, good radar, good data link. So it's ideally suited to the environment, but they've been down there for some years now and will carry on for the foreseeable future. There's no replacement fighter plan for the Typhoon, so you would think, if the current sort of situation carries on, they would carry on, as long as they're needed. Yeah. Sorry,
the time of Rhodesian UDI, I believe the Air Force was called to defend Lusaka against the Hawker divisions, but the air traffic controllers out of Salisbury, they were flying javelins, I think.
The Squadron Javelins was actually deployed from Cyprus down to Lusaka, and trying to remember the name of the other place. They were two bases basically they had in down in Zambia. But I'm not sure how the air traffic controls each. I think they flew their own controllers in actually their own mobile radar here as well for that very reason. I think one of the things was that the oil pipe actually also came from the coast. It actually came through Rhodesia, so they ended up having to fly all the oil in from Aden in big sort of rubber tanks. So yeah, I think quite interesting times.
I used to work for Marconi, but I hasten to add not on the Foxhound or radar system. I did work on the RWR system for Tornado.
Oh yeah.
I just wondered how effective it was.
We both flew with that system. You probably remember that the original Tornado bomber had the old RWE, an Italian system in there, and we recognised some of the deficiencies in that, so that was turfed out. So all the RAF Tornadoes, both ground attack and air defence, had the radar home and warning receiver. It was designed for the Tornado F2, F3, and the reason being, what we needed was a highly accurate direction finding capability in that front sector, in the area where the radar was sweeping. So we had antennas in the nibs of the Tornado F3, unlike the Tornado bomber, which didn't, which gave us highly accurate bearings in that front sector. We then had other antennas around the airframe, so it wasn't quite as accurate around and behind the aeroplane as it was in front. And equally, it wasn't 360 coverage, it was a band, quite flat band really. But as a system, extremely capable, but it was software driven. So it was only as good as the little man or lady in the programming office that put the ones and noughts into the software to make it work. It worked it was called a dwell strategy. It sort of bounced around between things that you thought you might be interested in, and then it sort of concentrated on that and tried to analyse what it was. So it should have come up and said, yes, it's a MiG-23 flogger with a Hilark radar or whatever. And more often than not, yes, it did that. But there were certain areas in the frequency range where there was an awful lot of aeroplanes operating, so particularly in the air-to-air intercept radar area. So occasionally it got a little bit confused in those sort of areas. But as a system, when it worked, it was extremely good. Very good indeed.
I'd echo that. Actually, we thought it was brilliant because it was, it was hands-off. It told you what you needed to know without you having to interpret it. Because the previous RWE, you had to know all the beeps and whistles and all the rest of it. So it did tell you, but it was really dependent on whatever software was in there, and different operational software packages came, which got better and better. I think to start with, we weren't terribly sure that it was good, but certainly, it did get very, very good. And well, I suppose the people who wrote the software got very good at doing it. And I think it's a very effective bit of kit.
I worked up at the Air Warfare Centre, and one of the units up there would program the software for the radar homing warning receiver, and it was called Mission Data, and they would choose, so say for example Mike's going off with his squadron to the Gulf, they would produce a pre-flight message specifically for the Gulf, which was tailored to the sort of things that it might find down there. So they focused in on the areas that they thought, that the types of airplanes, surface-to-air missiles they thought they'd come across. So it meant the software could be optimised for the area you were going to. Very, very clever, but very good. Yeah.
It's nice to know that it worked pretty good.
Big thanks from me. Thank you.